there's an issue with the Marvel Rivals player base, and that issue is that most players in this game like to focus on their stats. And when you hear this, you kind of think to yourself, well, isn't that the whole point of Marvel Rivals? Is to focus on your stats? Because if you focus on your stats, that indirectly means you're doing good as a player. And if you play this game, you probably realize that Marvel Rivals is literally built around focusing on your stats. Like the game literally incentivizes a lot of players to always focus on their stats. And I know most people probably can think of some examples of people focusing on their stats, like supports or tanks or DPS players, you know, their finals, their healing, damage blocked, all these type of things. But here's the problem. When people focus on their stats too much, they end up becoming tunnel vision and neglect other things. And what I mean by this is not every player in Marvel Rivals is obviously always going to be tunnel vision on their stats. I'm just saying that every Marvel Rivals player, especially the average player out there, is always, for some reason, always focusing on their stats. And they always fall into the same realm of getting tunnel vision on their stats, that it ends up becoming a problem in this game. And if you think I'm talking nonsense, Marvel Rivals is labeled as a team player game. So wouldn't it make more sense to focus on playing as a team rather than always focusing on your stats? And one of the things people neglect when they're focusing on their stats too much is that they never come to realize, or they never think to themselves that, hey, maybe since I'm always playing for my stats, maybe my method of playing for my stats is incorrect. And what I mean by this is that players think like, okay, I'm focusing on my stats, that means I'm doing a good thing, but they don't come to realize or even question that their method of getting those stats might not be the best optimal or the best way to get those stats to begin with. So, and I think that's like literally going to be my first point, is that most players that focus on stats end up becoming bad at the game and don't realize it why. Like, you never had a match when you're a support player, you out heal the other supports, even your other support on your team, you're always doing good, you always have your ultimate up, you're always playing well, but for some reason you just can't rank up. For some reason it seems like you're not the problem and that your team or the enemy team is the problem. But that's the thing, once we go further and further, you start realizing that stats, besides people just playing the wrong way and focusing on their stats the wrong way and their methods of getting good stats is wrong, it plays a big role in people's gameplays, in your teammates' gameplays, and their gameplay, because they're neglecting other things about this game. I'm gonna give first the easy example for most people can understand, and then work my way up to the hardest example where you kind of have to think about it more to understand what I'm trying to say. First one is DPS players that focus too much on finals rather than individual team fights. And what I mean by this is DPS players that have high finals, they end up believing they're not the problem or the reason why their team lost, and rightfully so. Most of the time, if you have a high final stat, that means that you were doing your job almost the entirety of the match. Like, getting a pick is never seen as a bad thing. It's always going to be a net positive. And I'm not trying to dispute that, not trying to argue between that. But the thing about it is that once you're in this headspace, or once you're in this mindset that like, oh, my stats matter, this healing stat indicates that I wasn't a problem for my team losing. But if you look at it, most of those stats or most of those finals you get, were they actually impactful? And this is what people try to argue with me, like, of course they were impactful, I got an elimination, that's always going to be seen as a good thing. But if you look at it the grand scheme of things, that's not always the case. Because yeah, you might have gotten like 2 or 1 pick or even 3, a triple kill with your ultimate or not with your ultimate, but the time those finals finally stack up or you finally get them, your team is either already dead, your team is about to die, or it's already too late where like your whole team is already dead before any of those impact kills can even matter. Same thing, if you get a pick, doesn't necessarily mean that it's always going to be a good pick or your team can capitalize on it. Because let's say the enemy team is running a Penny and they're running another tank like Thor, and they have like a Rocket and a Luna, and then the other DPS can be whatever, or they have like a Namor with like, let's say a good poke here will be like Widow. Even if you pick off like their Widow, their Thor, simply having Penny Mines and simply Rocket's beacon of resin them can still just keep your team stagnant. And I think most people can understand what I'm trying to say here. Now, the second thing would be about supports. Now, this one's kind of more, I think partly most people can understand, because a lot of people always have negative things to say about support players, and they kind of point out their own gameplay simply because they always get hate. Now, support players will focus on their healing stat because as a support, you're kind of incentivized to always focus on your healing stat. You're always incentivized to play for heals, means like your only job is just to heal the team, have your ultimate up when a big team fight or when someone else ult. But that's the thing, when you're a support player and you just primarily focus on healing, you'll automatically stick to the easiest route that can get you that healing stat. So what do? You just heal whatever's in front of you. You heal your tank because he's the closest. And if from your logical perspective, you think like, this is the best way to do this. Like, why wouldn't I just heal my tank? They're right there in front of me. They're missing more HP. They need it more. But the thing about it is that once you get into these higher ranks, and once you get to these like once you get like other players on your team that know how to play tank and know how to play support, you start realizing that your method is kind of outdated. And what I mean by this is that if you keep just always trying to get this high healing stat with your DPS, with your tank player, you end up neglecting your other DPS, you kind of neglect your other tanks, you kind of don't really look around, you kind of build this bad habit of just always healing what's in front of you. And another thing is that not only do you build these bad habits, you also start believing that you're not at fault for losing the match, because at the end of the game, you look at the scoreboard and you saw that your healing stat was good. That means that you were good support. That means you were doing what you had to do. But if you actually look at it closer, if the other supports had the same heals around you and your other support on your team had around the same amount of heals as you, what does that really like indicate? That like either you guys were doing pretty good, but that's what players stop, because like they don't believe they're at fault anymore. They don't believe they need to improve. They don't believe like that nothing can be said about them. So now those are like two reasons. Their method of getting those stats is too basic. It's kind of outdated. It's not the best way possible. It might have worked when you were in gold or in plat, where all you needed to do was just heal the tank. But once you develop those bad habits, you start performing better. Your team also starts getting affected by it. And the other one was, once you see that high healing stat, or you see your healing stat was pretty good, you start believing that you're not the problem and that there's nothing else you can do. And if you play Marvel Rivals, you understand that supports can do way more than just heal, and way more than just sit in the backline and just heal. Our next one we got is tank players. And now most people think like, you know, what's wrong with tank? You know, focusing on your stats as tank, that's not really like a thing you really focus on, because tank doesn't really have like a stat they can really focus on that much. I guess you can say how much damage they're blocking in the match, but most tank players never focus on it. They kind of really just focus on how they can use their ultimate, how much space they can take. But that's the thing. The reason why it's hard to explain how tank is like focusing on their stats and how it's bad for the game, it's kind of really hard to understand, and I'm probably not going to explain it that well. But here goes. When it comes to tanks, when they're only focusing on frontlining, focusing on absorbing damage, focusing on wanting to engage, when not to engage, you know, using their ult, saving their ult for either a cloak and dagger, or Luna's snow, or an invis ult, you know, trying to be useful, you know, use their best utility in the best ways possible. But that's really when like you got to really look at it, because when your tank is really just doing all that, that's always going to be a good sign they're doing good. But one of the biggest things people fall into, especially when they're playing tank, is that once they frontlining majority of the time, once they're absorbing a lot of damage, they believe they can't do no more, if that makes sense. They believe they can't, you know, they don't try to like adapt even more to what they already are adapting to. Because in their minds, they'll be like, all right, I'm just tanking, my impact is very like minimal and very limited. All I need to do is literally poke out maybe a couple of people in the front line, maybe their supports, disengage and re-engage when my cooldowns are up and I'm getting heals, and maybe backing up when my supports are getting dive. You know, they're expecting their team to follow through. But that's the thing, like when tank, you really gotta think about it, because their methods of just focusing on only doing that ends up becoming super outdated super fast. Because not every match where you're playing tank, you're always gonna be the one frontlining. Well, you're always gonna be frontline, but it's not always the same basic hit. It's not always the same basic routine where you just go in there, absorb as much damage, come out, and your DPS should be wiping out everything. Sometimes that does work, but if the enemy team is literally diving, if the enemy team is running triple support, if the enemy team is literally running triple DPS where they're outputting more damage than your supports can keep up, and even getting dove at the same time, or just getting picked off, you're realizing that like your role as tank has to evolve in order to do more. But a lot of tank players, this is what I was saying about tank players, a lot of them become lazy. And there's another reason why they end up being hard stuck, is because they never believe they're at fault, because they realize that their role is so limited. They'll be like, well, I'm just here to set up and absorb and be a distraction and maybe use my ult to counter other ults, but the rest is literally up to my team. I can't do anything. But if you ever seen a good tank player, you literally see that they try to take more initiative and they try to take more charge in what they do. So what that means is that some tanks players, instead of always playing frontline, they play in the middle, or they have like a middle formation with the team, instead of always like being a couple of feet away from their supports, because they realize if they literally stick like in a tight formation and they're always giving out callouts and they're always literally just trying to peel or trying to frontline in the best ways possible, that's when they're playing the best way. And it's kind of hard to understand, because it's kind of the same way of re-engaging and disengaging and being there and peeling, sometimes not peeling, sometimes peeling. That's like the whole tricky thing about tank, is that you can't just like be a support and just heal. You can't be a DPS player and re-engage by yourself when you're diving as Spider-Man. You really gotta like focus and really pay attention to these little details and know what to do in certain situations. Yeah, sometimes you can just go mad and start bullying everyone on like literally like the back line, the front line, I'd probably not do anything. But once you reach higher ranks, people can literally shut you down because the tenacity system in this game can literally just doesn't work. So you literally can get CC down and you basically end up dying with your team. Or you end up being the first death and then your whole team just collapses after that. Because your supports either try to save you or your DPS players try to provide support by peeling off either the Wolverine, the Bucky who like CC you down, or even the Luna Snow. And it's really coming to apparent because in Season 9, like tank might be the worst role ever since Season 9 and even Season 9.5. Even though Mag got a buff and all these things and they're becoming a little bit better, some of these things are just straight up like mags. I mean, not mags, but like tank players in this game. It's kind of like a horror example because once you meet a really good tank player, you realize that they're always evolving.